In this session, we're going to talk a little bit about managing a student podcast project. Since there are no attendees, this is going to be a very short introduction to this topic, but if anyone would like to know anything more, please contact me at my email address, which is john.kane@oswego.edu. So one question you might ask is, why might you like to have students do a podcast project? And it's a form of open pedagogy, and open pedagogy projects in general provide students with a little more autonomy where they're creating something rather than just consuming knowledge, or they're not just doing the same type of thing that they do in many of their other classes. So it gives them a little bit more sense of control over their projects, and often that leads to a bit more engagement. It also provides them with an opportunity, depending on how the assignment is constructed, to make personal connections to the material that you're discussing in your classes. And it's a form of a non-disposable assignment, which is different than most of the assignments students tend to do in school. In particular, if we give students a paper project or an essay assignment or some other form of written assignment that ends up going into our learning management system or digital learning environment, whichever name you prefer, what generally happens is students put a fair amount of work into this. They get submitted into the LMS, and then you provide them with grades and some feedback, and they may or may not look at the feedback, but they never get to see it again, and you all often never get to see it again. But when they create something like a podcast, they have something tangible. Maybe not tangible, but they have something that's going to last and have a life that goes beyond the class itself, especially if you give students the option of creating something that is public. And it's also a form of authentic assessment where they're being evaluated on something that has some value in itself, where they are constructing something that can be shared with others and that others can learn from. And also, students generally find this to be much more fun than writing still another term paper. It's also more fun for the instructors as well. So the assignment that I've used in my introductory classes and in my labor economics classes is to have students create 2 podcasts over the course of the semester. The one I've done this most often with now, I've done it 3 times, is in my introductory microeconomics class. And I asked them to do it in groups of 2 or 3 students. I did make the mistake of letting them do it as groups of 1 the first time, but I encouraged them to do it in larger groups, but it was an online class and they all chose to do it individually. And that added to the workload quite a bit for me. And it also was a much less engaging project for them because they were just talking into the void. This was during the early stage of the pandemic, and it was during the early stages. Yeah, it was during the beginning of the pandemic. And no, it wasn't. It was a year before the pandemic, but they were still just talking to a computer, as I was just doing until Maggie arrived. But in any case, since then, I've had them do them in groups, unless there's some reason, and they can just send me a note and explain why they can't. It may be because they have difficult schedules in terms of their life commitments or in terms of work that would make it difficult to work with others. But it's a much more engaging experience when they actually get to interact with other students. And for students in an online class, in an asynchronous online class, it provides them with an opportunity to connect to other humans in real time. And even though we can't require students to participate at a particular time, if they're working with 1 or 2 other people, they can usually find some time where they can meet over Zoom or some other platform just to record the podcast. And they can plan it either synchronously using Zoom or a similar tool, or they could plan it by using a Google document and just sharing information. And I use a discussion board where they can form groups. One project was done in the first half of the semester and one in the second half. And they all have to involve some real world application of course concepts where they have to take something they've learned and apply it to something out there in the world. It could be something in the news, it could be something in their own lives. And basically they have to make some connections of what they're learning, the theory they're learning, to real world applications, which again is a useful learning experience by itself. And I give them a list of topics in the first half, a long list of topics that they focused on, and similarly in the second half. But before I do it the very first time I did this, I asked a survey. I gave out a survey asking students what their concerns were. And there were two things that came back persistently. We also hear the same types of things when faculty are asked whether they might use recordings in their own classes. One is they might have some concerns about technology, about knowing how to record a podcast, whether they have the equipment, whether they know how to edit these things and so forth. And the other thing that comes up is they don't like to hear their own voice. And again, in both the case of faculty and students, while you may find your own voice annoying, and maybe it is, but it's the same voice that people hear every day. So no one else would think of it any differently than they would think of hearing your voice in person. It just sounds different to you. So what I did to help them get past this barrier is I gave them some simple instructions on how they can record audio files on either mobile or laptop devices, and also some simple ways in which they can do some basic editing. And I gave them a really low stakes initial assignment to get them started. I asked them to listen to a short Planet Money Indicator, Trade Talks, or Freakonomics podcast, and then just to record an audio response, a 2 to 5 minute audio response, and upload that to a Dropbox in the learning management system. And that got them past that anxiety about being able to record something and to upload it. And that pretty much eliminated the anxiety they felt about it. So as I mentioned before, got a little out of sequence. They were given a list of concepts. They formed a discussion forum where they could select partners and select topics, where they could talk about when they were free to record and also the topics they were interested in. They formed their own groups that way. And then in the Google Forum, they provided a list of all the partners in their project, the title of the podcast they had planned to do, and a brief description. And then I'd provide them with feedback at that stage. And this took place over about 6 weeks or so. And then in the next stage, the students met and they were given an option of either creating a detailed outline, which described their arguments, or a script. And I suggested to them that they could do either approach when they did the actual recording. They could either use an outline for the structure or a script, and they could record using both just to see how it works. And basically, the advantage of an outline is it lets them be a little bit more relaxed and it doesn't sound like they're just reading something from a script. On the other hand, when they are speaking without a script, they're more likely to put in lots of filler words and false starts at sentences, as I've done a few times just recently because I don't have a script here. And I told them they could record it both ways and see which sounds better. And I also gave them feedback on that initial submission. So one of the main issues is sometimes they were not applying economic analysis correctly, and I gave them some feedback and reminded them of ways in which they perhaps could improve this, and gave them pointers to what they might want to think about when they did follow the final version or a more final version. Then they submitted a draft audio podcast the next week. I gave them some feedback on that. And then I allowed them multiple attempts because sometimes, especially the people who had basic outlines, they went a bit astray in terms of how they were using economic analysis. That was generally the major problem, that they may have misunderstood things. And this was a really good way of revealing some misunderstandings of some of the basic tools they were supposed to learn, because those were things that were not coming out on the other assessments that were used in the class. And then, basically I just kept whatever their last score was from that. And then once they were happy with the audio, they would submit that final version of the audio on another Google form that contained the podcast title, an abstract of the podcast, put in the podcast description, a transcript, I let them use Auto, I encourage them to use Auto.ai, but they could use other transcription software. But that is free at the level they were using it. The audio file, and then just simply a question of whether they wish to post this publicly or whether they would only allow it to be posted within the class. And basically, I shared the form containing all the responses because that Google form had the links to the audio for the podcast. I made that public to everyone in the class, but no one else, so that basically I shared the copy of the form and students could go through and listen to all the podcasts for other people in the class. And then for those students who wanted to share their podcast publicly, I did create a podcast site where students could go and actually here is their podcast. So they're all out there, and I guess we've got a couple of followers. But well, I should qualify this. They should all be there, but I am about a year behind on getting these posted. It's been a rough couple of years, but they were all shared within the class, and eventually they will all be shared here along with the transcripts and so forth for those students who chose to make their podcasts public. Here is a set of instructions. These are the instructions I shared with students, as well as all the resources at each stage, a link to a sample form, to upload the materials and so forth. And you're welcome to download those, and you can get that. You can get that. The QR code is being blocked by the screen share. Let's see if it works.
Yeah, it still works.
Okay, good. And so if you would like to try this project, you're welcome to use any of these resources. And it's something that is very enjoyable. And this one should definitely work. This is a copy of the slides if you'd like that, which will include the link to the podcast resources. And in fact, we have a podcast coming up on the T for Teaching podcast sometime in late May and in early June, where we talk to another instructor who is teaching a political science class who adopted this project, and we talk about that on there. And this would be in June of 2022, in case you're listening to this a bit later. Okay, any questions from our audience here?
The only question I have is, and maybe you addressed this and I didn't catch it, but are there certain classes or certain levels of classes where this has worked better than other classes?
I've only used it in two. One is an introductory microeconomics class, and the other is an upper level labor economics class. And it actually worked pretty well in both. In fact, there was probably a little bit more engagement. There was more apprehension, but a bit more engagement in the introductory class. Mm-hmm. And in the very first time, they put together the intro and outro themselves, and they were pretty engaged in forming the titles and so forth. Mm-hmm. The upper level classes, the reactions have been a little bit more mixed. Now, the level of analysis was a little bit higher, and the applications were often a bit more interesting in the labor economics class, just because students had more background. But it seemed to work pretty well in both.
Any standout podcasts?
One of the really unfortunate things is some of the best podcasts were ones that students chose not to make public, but there were many really good ones. And there were some, well, we can go back to that. I can show a couple that were really good. I don't want to say any were not good. There were many of these that were really good. I'm trying to think of ones that were particularly well done. There was one of the very early ones was especially good, and that would be, actually, I think this was right here. That was good, but that wasn't the one I was thinking of. The people who did the well, this one was kind of interesting. It was about Well, that was about immigration and so forth. Aaron's podcast, there was a Scarcity 2 and another one earlier which talked about food deserts. They were very, very good. But they were all kind of good. The people who post them were generally very good podcasts. But I won't play it in the recording because I didn't enable the audio, which I should have done. But there are some good ones in here. So they are out there on Ozonomics here. And actually there's another website, which is, I believe it's ozonomics.com, maybe? No. .org. I should know that, and I'm sure it's in some of those other resources, but I will stop the recording before I fumble this any more than I already have.
Thank you.
Thanks. I don't know if anyone will watch it, but